Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest with Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 344, and we're covering Gaudium et Spes 67 on human labor is a key element in economics. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Today, we're continuing Chapter 3 of Part 2, and Chapter 3 is on economic and social life. And we are starting Section 2, Certain Principles Governing Socioeconomic Life as a Whole. The summary of today is that labor has a priority in economics, and we need to treat with respect to prioritizing workers. So this is a very valuable point. And it's something that I think is a little different now than it was in the 1960s, at least in the U.S. If you look at things like how companies valued like their employees and things like that, I think there was in many ways a lot more respect for that in big companies then than there is now, and things like that. And that's a real shame that we're in a worse spot and people haven't listened to what the Council Father said. But let's get into paragraph 67. It has 3 subparagraphs. We'll read them in 2 parts. A and B are human labor is the most important element of economics and should be treated as such. C, people should not be slaves of work, but should work hard and should have creativity. A is just going to be like one line. That's why A and B are combined. B is pretty long, but A is just one line. So let's read them. 67A. Human labor, which is expended in the production and exchange of goods or in the performance of economic services, is superior to the other elements of economic life, for the latter only have the nature of tools. B. This labor, whether it is engaged in independently or hired by someone else, comes immediately from the person, who, as it were, stamps the things of nature with his seal and subdues them to his will. By his labor, a man ordinarily supports himself and his family, is joined to his fellow men, and serves them, and can exercise genuine charity, and be a partaker in the work of bringing divine creation to perfection. Indeed, we hold that through labor offered to God, man is associated with the redemptive work of Jesus Christ, who conferred an eminent dignity on labor when at Nazareth he worked with his own hands. From this there follows for every man the duty of working faithfully, and also the right to work. It is the duty of society, moreover, according to the circumstances prevailing in it, and in keeping with its role, to help citizens find sufficient employment. Finally, remuneration for such labor is to be such that man may be furnished the means to cultivate worthily his own material, social, cultural, and spiritual life, and that of his dependents, in view of the function and productiveness of each one, the condition of the factory or workshop, and the common good. One of the key principles that this subparagraph points out, Ace points out, and I think is really important for us to remember, is that the church views, when we're talking about economic activity, it views that the primary element is human labor. Because in most production, you have 3 elements. You have, first of all, the person producing it. Second of all, the tools and things which is produced. And third of all, the final product. For example, I am a person. I am recording this podcast. I have a laptop and a decent external microphone, and I'm using a sound recording program, things like that. Those are my tools. And what's the result? The result is this podcast you're listening to. Or for example, you take someone, somebody who's like a plumber. Well, who are they? They're a plumber. What are the tools? Well, they have their wrenches and their soldering torches and all the different tools there. And and then they also have the things that there's more physical things that also are working that, like the actual pipes and things like that. And then what's the result? Well, it's a hopefully well-made plumbing job so your toilet doesn't clog next time you have an issue. Right? So that's the kind of thing that we are talking about here. There is this priority because why? Economics is about humans, not about machines, not about techniques. It's about humans. And we stamp ourselves into what we produce. What we produce is a product of ourselves. I think when we talk about AI producing things, this gets a little more complicated. in explaining it. I think it's still true, but I think it's going to be a great work of certain people in theology over the next decade or two to very clearly explain how AI is not working. AI is just a tool, because people are starting to think of it not as just a tool. This is a little bit not my focus, but that's something to think about here when we're talking about this. Now, this labor, this work also supports families. And as we noted before, the family is the basic unit of society. So if labor is supporting families, labor is supporting all of society by building up these basic units. And when we work, we collaborate with God and his divine creativity and things like that, right? If we work justly and properly. Obviously, if we're working to, be a mobster or something, that's not the same idea. And so we can offer our work to God as a sacrifice. Finally, it talks about the need of society towards people, right? We need to help find them and provide employment. There's a real shame that would happen if people had nothing, to do in their life that was meaningful. Now, obviously, not just employment is meaningful, but employment is some of how we find meaning. We find meaning when you say, look, and this great thing, and talking about employment and all these different things. That's a good thing. And that's important to note. And then we also, as a society, provide some kind of help to those who are unemployed, and we provide a fair wage to the employed. And how do we define a fair wage? I think the easiest way of thinking about it is that which can sustain a family. We go back 1 or 2 points above us, and we talked about how labor supports families. Well, if labor is going to support families, that labor needs to be that type that supports families, right? So, for example, a plumber makes enough that he and his wife and kids can survive, right? So here they talk about the life of him and his dependents. Dependents would be an economic term for family that depend on you, wife, kids, if your parents live with you, things like that. Moving on to 67C, it's about people should not be slaves to work, but also people should work hard. Let's read it. Since economic activity, for the most part, implies the associated work of human beings, any way of organizing and directing it, which may be detrimental to any working men and women, would be wrong and inhuman. It happens too often, however, even in our days, that workers are reduced to the level of being slaves to their own work. This is by no means justified by the so-called economic laws. The entire process of productive work, therefore, must be adapted to the needs of the person and to his way of life. Above all, to his domestic life, especially in respect to mothers and families, always with due regard for sex and age. The opportunity, moreover, should be granted to workers to unfold their own abilities and personality through the performance of their work. Applying their time and strength to their employment with a due sense of responsibility, they should also all enjoy sufficient rest and leisure to cultivate their familiar, cultural, social, and religious life. They should also have the opportunity to freely develop the energies and potentialities which perhaps they cannot bring to much fruition in their professional work. So, this subparagraph is talking about how we organize work, how we organize things, right? We can't organize it to the detriment of workers. We're just a big challenge now is just for the shareholders, just for the big money people, and not at all for the workers. That is a huge problem in current American organization of companies. I don't know I don't know exactly the solution. I'm not an expert in every little detail, but we can see how companies have moved away from prioritizing workers towards prioritizing shareholders and nothing else. And here it also notes we can't make ourselves slaves of work. It's tough to define a slave of work here because one of the challenges in work is that a lot of people who want to work for themselves or want to work on something that they know doesn't make as much money but is important or valuable to them are the people who don't make as much money, right? So, for example, take myself. I was doing a degree in computer engineering. I don't know exactly where I would have ended up, but I can almost guarantee you that had I continued, I would be making more money than I am as a priest. And right now I'm teaching a seminary. I make the basic salary of a priest despite having, a doctoral degree and all these other things as well. I'm not complaining, but I work hard and things like that. And part of that is that I think this is valuable work. It's meaningful to me and it helps me out. And so I'm not working simply for money. And so I'm not really a slave of work in that sense. But it's a challenge when you have people who are barely making minimum wage and have to work 70 hours a week or something to pay the bills. That seems much more like a slave of work. Or working the same amount of hours as me. I probably don't work quite 70, more like 50 or 60, but that same idea. The next thing noted is that we need to respect family life. Respect time for mom and kids. Here, I would note that the United States does not have maternity leave. It's the only developed country that does not have mandated maternity leave that can help families. Different countries have different policies, and fund it different ways. But I think it is valuable that we give mothers time off and they get paid for that. So they're not starving, or they're not, the person who's not doing well economically isn't like, oh, I got to go back to work tomorrow, like 2 days after I had my kid because, well, can't pay the bills otherwise. That's an issue. Yes, the U.S. has unpaid maternity leave, and many states and many companies do have paid maternity leave, but we have to put the rules in for the people who are most likely to be exploited, the people who are most likely to be in these bad situations. And I could think of somebody like, a cashier at a gas station in not so rich area of the country or something as kind of, maybe not the best economically off person. They're still respected. It's still great to see their work. You go in and grab I go in and grab a snack if I'm on the road or something. But those are often on the lower end of pay scales. Finally, we have allowing workers to unfold abilities by doing work, right? Our strength and our creativity, develop the different potentialities. And one of the things that it notes in this last paragraph is have the ability to have developed their energies and potentialities, even those they can't bring about in the professional work. There's a lot more people who enjoy art and do decent art than there is people to pay for decent art, to pay a salary of enough people to do that decent art, right? Now, obviously, there's different styles that people like and things like that. But part of this idea of free time and creativity is this idea that people can, make art on their free time, and maybe they only make $3 an hour for that, but that's really their relaxation. So it's no issue. I know, for example, one of my aunts, my uncle had a very good job, and my aunt loved sewing. And she would sew all these different things, and she would go to craft fairs and sell her sewing. And I think she made a little bit of money more than her costs, but she didn't make a ton of money. But it was a great way for her to develop this potentiality. And we would have all these wonderfully sewed things in our house because that would be Christmas presents from her all the time. I remember she made these stuffed animal dinosaurs that I loved when I was a little boy. So this concludes today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. Talking about labor, I do this podcast on a volunteer basis, and my local religious community relies on donations to pay our bills. If you want to support my community and support my work, you can go to patreon.com/frmatthewlc. There's also a link for this and a one-time donation using Acceptiva, which is the payment processor, at my own site, frmatthewlc.com. You can also support StarQuest at sqpn.com/give. Tomorrow we're going to continue with the next paragraph of Gaudium Spes, paragraph 68 on peaceful resolutions in economic disputes. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information on the podcast, like playlists and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SGPN on Facebook and X.
Amen.